It wouldn't be a discussion about the cost of living crisis if we didn't call out the supermarket giants Woolworths and Coles.
Broccoli? $10 for a broccoli? We can put it on special.
How much?
Well, $10. We'll just write special on it.
Can you still feed your family for under $10?
Shut the up.
What about cheese?
No, like 12 but 13, $14.
Good work.
Because inflation's been so tough.
Yeah, really tough.
Feel for a ride.
How can anyone get ahead in this market? What?
This is embarrassing. I've just gone and bloody had a record profit again.
Congratulations.
You know, I'm sticking on the notice board. No one really cares anyway.
I'm here for the meeting.
Basically, that was saying that Woolworths and Coles have a lovely, cosy relationship when it comes to price, and Aldi put their head in the door and was told to leave. Now, competition, a free market, pull the other one. That clip from Kick It Forward is pretty much on the money, and shoppers are starting to notice. Joining me to discuss this is Nick Hozak, a public policy consultant and former director at the Australian Bankers Association. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Alexandra. Nice to be here.
Look, Nick, does Australia have a problem with the pricing of goods inside the supermarket oligarchy?
Well, look, you've got a very high market share for Coles and Woolworths. In particular, Woolworths is a very, very big company. It dominates groceries and food. And so the disposition you have is a suspicion that with that sort of market power, that prices could edge up, and in all sorts of ways that perhaps we don't realise. But at the end of the day, when you check how much you've spent on groceries and you've been to Woolworths, you'll probably realise it's quite a lot.
Well, I remember when a full shopping trolley was worth about $100, and that was considered to be a big family shop. But last weekend, I was able to carry $60 worth of vegetables home in a small bag, and that was enough food to keep me alive for a couple of days, and I don't really eat much. So people are trying to work out if the price of goods is due to genuine rising costs or if consumers are being ripped off. Now, it's not as if they have the information necessary to determine if these prices are reasonable or fair. At what point, Nick, does it become acceptable for a government to intervene or look at the price of food?
Well, I think that the government has a responsibility to ensure there is competition, or as much competition in the market as possible. I was in one of the major supermarkets pretty earlier in the year. I think it was about February, and I went to buy some lamb chops, and I think there were 6 or might have been 8 in the little tray, and that was $24. So, somebody's making a lot of money out of that, and I suspect it's not the farmers. I suspect that there's a middleman, and it's probably the management of these big supermarkets that are really benefiting from prices like that.
Well, it would be one thing if the price of fresh produce was being passed on to the farmer to help out with the rising costs of productions. I mean, after all, we can all sympathise with Aussies growing our food being slapped with excessive green tape, enormous biosecurity regulations and levies, green taxes and the cost pressures of droughts and floods and wages, etc. Now, all of these things make our food more expensive, but farmers are not being paid more for their produce. They're shooting their stock and ploughing their produce into the ground because they cannot survive. The supermarkets, however, are walking off with big profits. Now, no one is saying that supermarkets shouldn't make a profit, but the pub test says that something is wrong. Now, you talked about the grocery code of conduct popping up as a solution. What is this, and what does it seek to do?
The grocery code of conduct is there to help sort of govern the relationship between the major supermarkets and the suppliers. And the idea is that with some principles set down, there's a reasonable dispute resolution. There's some principles around how to conduct sort of transparent and reasonable commercial negotiations with suppliers. So it's there to provide a sort of a moderating force to make sure that at a minimum, Coles, Woolworths and some others are sort of abiding by reasonable principles in negotiating with suppliers. That's the idea.
Well, you've written a piece in Flat White that talks about muddying the waters when it comes to public relations as a tactic. Now, can you explain this muddying the waters, how it relates to Woolworths in the context of the recommendations by the former ALP Minister Craig Emerson regarding the Grocery Code of Conduct?
Yes, well, it's a public relations strategy, which is what I called out in the piece. and that was that Craig Emerson, former ALP minister, but respected economist as well, has recommended that this code of conduct no longer be voluntary, but it be made mandatory. And it's being made mandatory, in addition with some much stiffer fines, means that it's going to be a pretty tough regulatory burden potentially on the big supermarkets, because they have to make sure not only do they sort of, they abide by in spirit, but they really need to abide by in a black letter way, and that's very costly. So Woolworths, in responding to this, had a very interesting tactic. Now, they wanted to de-escalate the negative publicity around it, and a public relations strategy to do that is you essentially agree with your critics. So Emerson came out and said this thing should be made mandatory, and Woolworths agreed with that. Now, so that de-escalated the issue, but there was a very, very interesting write-up that they put on that position, and that was, yes, we agree with it, but we wanted it extended to Chemist Warehouse, Bunnings, and other major retailers. Now, that's very clever, because that's called muddying the waters. So what they're doing now is they've de-escalated it, but they'll now go through a process whereby they'll join with Chemist Warehouse and others in one way or another to kind of undermine the call for it to be mandatory. So it's a sort of a 101 PR tactic, and I was a little bit surprised Woolworths used it. I would have thought they should have been a little bit more responsible than that. Effectively, what they're saying is to deal with our monopoly situation, all the other retailers, despite how popular you are, Chemist Warehouse is very popular, Bunnings is very popular, Woolworths wants to hit them with a regulatory layer, just so they don't have to deal directly with the problems that they've caused. And I think that's a bit silly, and they should not have done that.
Well, I guess there are two arguments at play here. The first is that it's reasonable for all large chains to find themselves subject to rules based around pricing. So if Woolworths and Coles have to do it, then why not Bunnings and Chemist Warehouse? But then there's the other side of this discussion, which is, where the Australian bureaucracy has got itself into this habit of creating more and more regulation every time one business does the wrong thing. So instead of punishing an individual company, the answer is to regulate. Are we in danger of over-regulating the supermarket industry?
Well, I think that's right. And what Woolworths is wanting to do is they're wanting to extend that regulatory blanket as wide as they can. And I think the strategy in doing that is they know that's probably not going to happen. And because it's not going to happen means that potentially the code won't be made mandatory, and then they won't have to look at it from a black letter point of view.
In other words, nothing happens to them. They got rid of their PR problem and they escaped scot-free. But it seems to me
that is certainly the strategy of muddying the waters, which I believe they've undertaken. And so the government is put in this position: do we now regulate everyone, or do we kind of breach a sensible public policy principle, and that is that rules should apply to all businesses which compete? So Woolworths has put the government in a very difficult situation. And so my conclusion after all of that, well, why don't we just attack the problem at its source? Yes, that is that Woolworths has just got too much market share.
Well, I was going to ask you about this, because you've stumbled over the critical word, which is competition. It seems to me that the solution is a free market, where competition from independent retailers keeps the big supermarket chains in check. But a free market cannot exist where the big supermarkets price fix below cost with the intention of absorbing the loss long enough to kill off their small business competition. Now, that's effectively how Amazon has starved out thousands of competitors. It's a tactic that has been, raised in the UK, where they've come into big supermarkets come into a village, trade below cost for several months, hand out heaps of gift cards, and then when everybody else closes, they are the last shop standing, and then they raise prices. So local residents have streets full of boarded up shops and money laundering fronts that are left, and no choice when it comes to where they buy their groceries. Now, given that the reason prices are being driven relates to the destruction of the free market, would it not be better, as you say, to investigate antitrust laws, for example? And if so, is there room for the government to do this?
Well, I think you've touched on the key point. I mean, look at Australian farmers. They are the most competitive in the world. And the reason they're the most competitive in the world is because from the early 1980s, basically, all subsidies, just about all tariffs were reduced, and they were forced to get themselves so efficient that they could actually export into regions. And they managed to do that. And I think we need a similar sort of approach for supermarkets. And that is that they should not be able to dominate suppliers. They should not be able to put up prices because there's a lack of competition. So what are the sort of the light touch regulatory solutions to that? I'm not sure there are any. So maybe there needs to be a heavier intervention, albeit a surgical one, and that is to try and reduce the market power of Woolworths by forced divestiture in some areas, particularly where they just totally dominate particular markets.
Particularly in home brand things where all of your favourite brands vanish off the shelf and are replaced by almost identical copies, but made by Woolworths and Coles. Now, there needs to be balance, obviously, between regulation and competition and profit. Capitalism is a wonderful system, but we know it requires scaffolding to stop it becoming abusive. And the biggest threat to a healthy capitalist system is, of course, the creation of monopolies. Now, even worse than monopolies are monopolies that hop into bed with the government and play politics. Now, on a final note here, you mentioned the role of the Liberal Party in your piece, as they are meant to be the defender of free market principles. Are they jumping into this debate, or is it pretty much being left in the hands of Albanese?
Well, I think that they have entered debate to some extent, at least through the National Party. The National Party is talking about a pro-competition policy, and that is divestiture where there are competition concerns. And so the coalition through that has actually entered the debate. So I think that's a really healthy thing. But you're right, we've got to be very careful about politicians sitting down with kind of corporate elites and determining how the world should work. And I think we are at risk of that with the Albanese government. So there's no easy solutions here, but I think if we could look at serious ways of ensuring that Woolworths competes both by paying its suppliers the proper price and by keeping prices on the shelves down, I think we really should look at those solutions or policies very carefully, and divestiture has to be in that mix, in my point of view.
Well, we want happy farmers, we want happy customers, and we want successful businesses in this country in order to keep Australia prosperous and free. Well, thank you for joining us here today on Spectator TV, Nick.
Thanks very much, Alexandra. Thanks for having me.